Okay, so in the video today, I'm going to be showing you how to make the Feeling Loopy dress. This is from my sewing pattern called the Feeling Loopy pattern, which offers 3 different views. One is the dress, one is the top, and one is the mini crop top. Every single view has a different video, but the instruction booklet that you'll get with your purchased PDF pattern all comes as one. So the steps in the video correspond to what the instructions say in the booklet. So that means that as you go through the dress video today, you'll see that you'll skip steps, but that's because for the dress view, you don't need to do the top view instructions and you don't need to do the mini crop top view instructions. So those steps are in the video specifically for those views. So don't be alarmed if you're jumping from like step 12 to step 19 or something like that. You're following the right video, it's just for the dress view. Besides that, you'll also see that there's multiple choices within the video. So you will have 2 options for seam finishes, and I'm just going to show you one, but I'll pop up the illustrations from the instruction booklet for both options so that you can have a visual reference of the 2 different options that you could use for the seam finish. The reason for this is one of my goals with Forest and Thread was to teach people to make really high-end garments. Seam finishes are what takes a garment from being kind of like a basic level to a really high-end level. Feel free to ignore any seam finishes you don't want to do and just use an overlock or zigzag stitch to finish your raw edges, or go ahead and practice your skills and learn something new and try the bias binding or the French seam, and it'll be there in the video and you can ignore it if you want to. It's totally up to you. Throughout the video, I'll be referencing those higher end seam finishes that I'm talking about. I made separate videos for each of the seam finishes. So there's a separate video for a French seam, how to make continuous bias tape, how to sew a bias binding around a seam, and there's even another video for how to gather. If you're someone who hasn't really had much experience with gathering, then I have a separate video for all of those details. They will all be linked, they'll all be available on my channel, and that way you can just pull up those videos in a separate tab and you can just bounce back and forth throughout the video so that you can watch them as many times as you need, and you can even reference them when you're doing another project. I kind of like the idea of creating a stitch library for you, so you have like a resource guide of all the types of seam finishes that I teach you in my patterns. And so my YouTube channel, I'll just keep building this resource library of different seam finishing techniques. This is kind of like my first stab at doing that. So let me know what you think of that. So back to the pattern having multiple options, you also have the option between wide strap ties or narrow straps. And then you have 2 options for back closures. You have the option for an invisible zipper and you have the option for back ties. So in the video, I'm making a dress that has the wide strap ties and the invisible zipper, but I'm going to insert video of me making the top view with those 2 options of the narrow straps and the back ties so that you can visually see me working on those and you don't have to bounce back and forth between a different video. So although this video is only for the dress, you'll see a couple of clips of me working on the top, but that's just to show you the narrow straps and the back ties option, and it will be relevant if you're working on those for the dress. Throughout the video, with those various options jumping back and forth, there's going to be a bar at the top that says back ties option or invisible zipper option or narrow straps option or wide straps option. It should be very clear which step you're on for which option, and you can just skip ahead to the next step by clicking on the timestamps at the bottom of the video, and you can just like skip to the next step if it's not the option that you're choosing to use for your Feeling Loopy dress. Okay, I think that's all the information to start you off with the video. I think these are some of my best videos yet, so I hope that you like them. I love this pattern and I hope that you do too, so have fun and I'll see you next time. Here are the materials that you will need to make the Feeling Loopy dress. You're going to need your self fabric or your main fabric. Lightweight fabrics are recommended for the Feeling Loopy dress. I'm going to be using this cotton broadcloth. You're going to need lightweight fusible interfacing. You'll need matching thread to your fabric. This is optional depending on your closure choice. You can use a hook and eye at the top of your invisible zipper. An invisible zipper is needed if you're going to be using that back closure choice. An optional step is adding foam bra cups within the bodice outer layer and the bodice lining. Foam bra cups are available in various sizes, so order one according to your personal sizing. Prepare your pattern for your chosen view and chosen size. I like to use a notch cutter to cut out the notches along the edges of the pattern. This makes it easier for marking your fabric. I also like to use a screw punch, which is a really handy tool for marking areas within the pattern. I'm going to use it for the dart point. Prepare your fabric. You should wash and dry your fabric according to how you will wash and dry your garment, and then press your fabric. Cut out your fabric according to the size, layout, and view that you are making. Cut out your inner facing. If you are making the wide strap tie version, then you're going to want to cut out interfacing of your wide strap tie pattern piece. If you're using a thicker fabric, you may be able to skip this step. I just like how it reinforces a lighter weight fabric for keeping the straps nice and neat. Mark your notches. Make sure to mark the center front notch on any pattern pieces that are cut on the fold. Apply your fusible interfacing. Using the appropriate iron setting for your fabric choice, lay your front bodice fabric face down and your matching interfacing piece glue side down on top. Press slowly and carefully over the interfacing until it adheres to the fabric. I like to lift up my iron and spot press it first to make sure you don't stretch the interfacing as you move the iron. Repeat this method for your back bodice pieces, and repeat it again for your bottom bodice band pieces. If you are using the wide strap ties, repeat this method for all 4 of these pieces as well. The Feeling Loopy dress requires bias tape for finishing the loopy layer. I like to make continuous bias tape at the beginning of my project and then just wrap it around some scrap cardboard or paper and set it aside for later when I need it during the sewing construction steps later on. Check out my other video for how to make continuous bias tape. Fold your narrow straps and back ties in half lengthwise with right sides together and pin in place along the raw edges. Sew your narrow straps and back ties along the raw edges using a 1/4 inch or 6 mm seam allowance. If needed, due to stiffer fabrics, trim your excess seam allowance down to 1/8 inch or 3 mm. Using either a super tiny safety pin or loop turner, which I'm using here, turn your narrow straps and back ties right side out. Press your narrow straps and back ties flat with the seam directly on the edge. Repeat these steps for all 6 pieces and set aside for later. Fold your wide strap ties in half lengthwise with right sides together and pin along the long edges. Sew along the length of your wide strap ties using 1/2 inch or 13 mm seam allowance. Pivot your needle at the corner and sew along the short edge of your wide strap ties using 1/2 inch or 13 mm seam allowance. Trim your seam allowance down to 1/4 inch along that short edge. Trim your corner at a 45-degree angle in order to make a nice crisp corner. Turn your wide strap ties right side out. I like to use a bobby pin to push the sewn short edge down into the tubular tie. You can also use a knitting needle or a chopstick to do this as well. Use the bobby pin end to push out the finished corners, hold the tie vertical with the open end at the bottom, and let the bobby pin drop out. Press your seam directly on the edge. Repeat this for all 4 ties and set aside for later. Transfer the dart point onto the wrong side of your front bodice pieces. You may also want to transfer the dart legs to help guide you as you sew. The seam allowance here is 1/4 inch or 6 millimeters. With right sides facing, pin the dart edges together. Sew with 1/4 inch or 6 millimeter seam allowance from the dart opening to the dart point. Leave your threads long. And tie a double knot at the point of your dart. And then trim your threads. Using a tailor's ham or a rolled up towel to create a curved surface safe for ironing, press the seam allowance down along the dart. Make sure the dart point is being gently pressed into a curved shape. It's good to pull the dart point nice and taut. With right sides facing, pin your front bodice and back bodice together along the side edges. Match the interfaced front bodice with the interfaced back bodice. Make sure the single notches are on the top and the double notches are on the bottom edge to ensure the correct orientation of both pieces. The back bodice doesn't have any notches along the side edge. Sew together with 1/2 inch or 13 millimeter seam allowance. Grade your seam allowance and press your seam allowance away from the front bodice. Pin 1 narrow strap to each of the notches on the top edge of your interfaced back bodice pieces. Make sure to pin them to the right side of your back bodice with the strap coming down away from the top edge. Sew with 1/4 inch or 6 millimeter seam allowance. Bring the other end of each strap to the notches on the top edge of your interfaced front bodice piece. Be careful not to twist the strap. Make sure to pin them to the right side of the front bodice with the strap coming down away from the top edge. You may want to do a quick fitting here and double check that the strap length is correct for your personal preference. Trim the strap length accordingly. Sew with 1/4 inch or 6 millimeter seam allowance. Pin the remaining back ties to each of the notches along the center back edge on the interfaced back bodice pieces. You want 2 straps attached to each side so that you can tie them closed while wearing. Make sure to pin them to the right side of the back bodice with the straps coming away from the side edge. Sew with 1/4 inch or 6 millimeter seam allowance. For extra strength and security, you may wish to add a little scrap of interfacing over each end of the narrow straps and back ties, where you've attached them to the bodice. The finished dress, specifically, ends up hanging from these little straps, and it can cause a lot of strain on the fibers for the shoulder straps. The center back ties can go under a lot of strain as well if you wish to tie them quite tight around the bust. Cut 8 little rectangle pieces approximately 1 inch by 3/8 of an inch or 2.5 centimeters by 1 centimeter in size. Adhere the fusible interfacing to the right side of the garment directly over where you have attached the straps within the seam allowance, which is 1/2 inch or 13 millimeters. Pin the short raw edge of the wide strap tie to each of the notches on the top edge of your interfaced front bodice and back bodice piece. Make sure to pin them to the face side of the bodice pieces with the straps coming down away from the top edge. Center the wide strap ties directly over the notches. You may want to do a quick fitting here and double check the strap placement along the top edge. The wide strap ties are intended to cover a bra strap. If you plan to wear this garment with a bra, try on the bodice piece over your bra and adjust the strap placement accordingly. Sew with a 1/4 inch or 6 mm seam allowance. Sew your front inner layer and back inner layer together along the side edges with option 1 or 2. The back inner layer side edge has no notches. Option 1 is to use an overlock or zigzag stitch to finish your seam allowance. Option 2 is to sew a French seam. I'm going to sew a French seam. If you want to follow along, there's a separate video that walks you through how to sew a French seam specifically for the Feeling Loopy dress. After finishing your seam with option 1 or 2, press the seam towards the back inner layer. Finish the center back edges of your back inner layer with option 1 or 2. I'm showing you option 2. Fold the center back raw edge under a 1/4 inch or 6 mm towards the wrong side of your fabric and press. Fold under another 1/4 inch or 6 mm along the same center back edges to completely enclose the raw edge and press. Sew an edge stitch. With right sides facing, pin the back inner layer pieces along the center back edges from the hem up until the notch. Sew together just inside of the finished center back edges. Press your seam allowances open. For the invisible zipper option, trim away a 1/4 inch or 6 mm seam allowance from each center back edge. Ignore the fusible interfacing you're seeing right now. I actually changed it so you apply it after you trim away the center back edge. Apply a 5/8 inch or 16 mm strip of interfacing to the wrong side of your back inner layer pieces along the center back edges, just 1 inch or 2.5 centimeters past the notch. Finish each center back edge separately with an overlock or zigzag stitch. With right sides facing, pin the back inner layer pieces together along the center back edge from the hem up until the notch. Sew together with 1/2 inch or 13 mm seam allowance. Press your seam allowances open. Finish the notched edge of your side outer middle layer with option 1 or 2. I'm going to show you option 2. Fold the notched edge under a 1/4 inch or 6 mm towards the wrong side of your fabric and press. Fold another 1/4 inch or 6 mm under along the same notched edge to completely enclose the raw edge. Press again. Sew an edge stitch. With right sides facing, pin 2 mirrored side outer middle layer pieces together along the finished notched edges from the bottom edge up until the notch. Sew together just inside of the finished edges, just up until the notch. Press your seam allowances open. Prepare your side outer middle layer for gathering the top edge, sewing with a basting stitch length of approximately 4 to 5 mm. Stitch along the top edge of your side outer middle layer with a 3/8 inch or 1 cm seam allowance. and sew along the same top edge with a 5/8 inch or 16 millimeter seam allowance. Sew each of your side, outer, middle layer top edges separately and keep the center seam allowances pressed under. Leave your beginning and ending threads extra long. Gather your piece until the top edge per side of each side, outer, middle layer measures the indicated length for your size listed in the charts. See my separate video for how to gather if you need more detailed instructions. Set your stitch length back to a regular amount of approximately 2.5 or 3 millimeters and sew along your gathered edge with 1/2 inch or 13 millimeter seam allowance. You should be sewing in between your two basting stitch lines. Keep your basting stitches intact for now. Finish the shorter straight edge of your pocket bag with option 1 or 2. I'm going to show you option 1. Trim away a 1/4 inch or 6 millimeter seam allowance and then finish with an overlock or zigzag stitch. Finish the curved edge furthest away from the notches by folding the edge under a 1/4 inch or 6 millimeters towards the wrong side of your fabric and press. Fold another 1/4 inch or 6 millimeters under along the same curved edge to completely enclose the raw edge. Press again. Sew an edge stitch. With right sides facing, match the finished curved edge to the notches along the straight edges, creating an asymmetrical folded piece. Pin together along both straight sides. Sew with 1/2 inch or 13 millimeter seam allowance along either side. Finish the seam allowance with raw edges using an overlock or zigzag stitch. Bring the wrong side of your side, outer, middle layer to match the top curved edge of the taller side of your pocket bag. Place the pocket bag 1/2 inch or 13 millimeters away from the straight raw edge of your side, outer, middle layer. The gathered top edge of your side, outer, middle layer should follow the same curve as your pocket bag. Pin together. The shorter inner layer of your pocket bag should remain free on the inside. Sew together using a 1/4 inch or 6 millimeter seam allowance. Sew your side, outer, middle layer with the pocket bag attached to your front, outer, middle layer along the side edge with option 1 or 2. Option 1 is a French seam. Option 2 is an overlock or zigzag stitch. I'm going to show you option 2. Pin your side, outer, middle layer with the pocket bag attached to your front, outer, middle layer along the side edge. Sew with 1/2 inch or 13 millimeter seam allowance along the side edge, making sure to keep your pocket bag free. Finish the seam allowances together with an overlock or zigzag stitch. Press towards the front, outer, middle layer. Starting at the top edge of your front, outer, middle layer, pin your bias tape right sides facing to the curved edge of your front, outer, middle layer, continuing onto the gathered top edge of your side, outer, middle layer, all the way until the seam with the slit opening. Measure 15 inches or 38 centimeters from the slit opening along the bias tape. And then trim your bias tape. Sew using 1/2 inch or 13 millimeter seam allowance. It is helpful to sew with your garment pieces facing up and the bias tape facing down, so you can use the previously sewn stitch line on the side, outer, middle layer as your guide. Trim your seam allowance down to a scant 1/4 inch or 6 millimeters. Continue trimming a 1/4 inch or 6 millimeters off the top edge of your bias tape. Press the bias tape away from the front, outer, middle layer and side, outer, middle layer pieces. Flip your piece to be right side face down. Fold your bias tape in 1/4 inch or 6 millimeters along the raw edge and press. Fold the very end of your extra bias tape that continues past the slit opening edge under 1/4 inch or 6 millimeters for an easy finished edge as you sew. Press the extra bias tape in half to create long little strings. Fold your bias tape over your raw seam allowance, completely enclosing it with the bias tape, and press in place. From the right side of your piece, pin the bias tape in place. You may find it helpful to baste your bias tape in place prior to sewing from the right side to make sure you catch the folded edge underneath. You can sew a basting stitch or alternatively use basting glue. Sew an edge stitch along the bias tape, catching the folded bias tape on the underside of your piece. Continue stitching the additional length of bias tape past the slit opening edge by sewing an edge stitch to keep the bias tape neatly folded into 1/4 inch or 6 millimeter string. Remove the basting stitches with a seam ripper and thread scissors. Repeat all of step 15 for the back outer middle layer and the remaining side outer middle layer pieces. Finish the center back edge of your back outer middle layer with option 1 or 2. The center back edge is the notched straight edge on your back outer middle layer. I'm going to show you option 2. Fold the edge under 1/4 inch or 6 millimeters towards the wrong side of your fabric and press. Fold another 1/4 inch or 6 millimeters under along the same notched edge to completely enclose the raw edge. Press again. Sew an edge stitch. With right sides facing, pin your back outer middle layer pieces together along the finished notched edges, from the bottom edge up until the notch. Sew together just inside of the finished edges, so just from the notch down to the hem. Press your seam allowances open. Sewing with a basting stitch length of approximately 4 to 5 millimeters, stitch along the top edge of your front outer middle layer and back outer middle layer pieces, with a 3/8 inch or 1 centimeter seam allowance and a 5/8 inch or 16 millimeter seam allowance. Sew each back outer middle layer top edge separately and keep the center seam allowances pressed under. Leave your beginning and ending threads extra long. The side outer middle layer with the pocket bags should be on the front. Pull your assembled inner layer within your assembled outer middle layer. Align the top raw edges. Center back should match as well as center fronts. The right side of both layers should be facing out. Using the notches along the top edges of your front inner layer and back inner layer pieces as a guide, gather your front outer middle layer and back outer middle layer to match the length indicated by the notch positions. If you need more detailed instructions for how to gather, check out my video specifically for how to gather. Pin your gathered front outer middle layer top edge to your front inner layer, matching the side edges to the notches. Set your stitch length back to a standard length of approximately 2.5 or 3 millimeters and sew along your gathered edge with 1/2 inch or 13 millimeter seam allowance. You should be sewing in between your two basting stitch lines. Keep your basting stitches intact for now. Pin your gathered back outer middle layer top edge to your back inner layer, matching the side edges to the notches. If you are using an invisible zipper as your closure option, then align the back outer middle layer center back edge 5/8 of an inch or 16 millimeters away from the center back edge of your back inner layer. Measure the 5/8 inch or 16 millimeters with the seam allowance unfolded and pin it in place. If you're using the back ties closure option, then align the back outer middle layer center back edge directly on top of the center back edge of your back inner layer and pin it in place. Sew along your gathered edge using 1/2 inch or 13 millimeter seam allowance. You should be sewing in between your two basting stitch lines. Keep your basting stitches intact for now. Bring your interfaced front bodice and back bodice pieces right sides together with the prepared bottom inner layer and outer middle layer. Match the bottom edge of your bodice with the top edge of your bottom inner layer and outer middle layer. Your gathered outer middle layer should be sandwiched in between your bodice and bottom inner layer. Pin in place, matching side seams and center front notches along the way. For the center back ties option, the center back edges of your back bodice pieces should hang over the bottom inner layer and outer middle layer center back edges by 1/2 inch or 13 millimeters. For the invisible zipper option, the center back edges should match. Sew along your pinned edge with 1/2 inch or 13 millimeter seam allowance. Remove the basting stitches from your outer middle layer with a seam ripper and thread scissors. With right sides facing, pin together two mirrored bottom bodice band pieces along the center front middle notched edge. Make sure to match the interfaced bottom bodice band pieces together. Sew with 1/2 inch or 13 millimeter seam allowance. Press your seam allowances open. If you're doing the back ties option, continue on to the next step. For the invisible zipper option, finish the bottom edge of your bottom bodice band pieces with option 1 or 2. The bottom edge has no notches along it. I'm going to show you option 2. Fold under 1/2 inch or 13 millimeter seam allowance and press in place. Bring the right side of your interfaced bottom bodice band piece to the wrong side of your assembled garment along the bodice seam line. Match the top notched edge of your bottom bodice band to the bottom layer of your bodice seam. The bottom layer should be sandwiched in between the bottom bodice band and the front bodice and back bodice pieces. Pin together, matching notches along the way. Match the side seam notch on your bottom bodice band to the side seam on your front bodice and back bodice. Match the center front seam on your bottom bodice band to the center front notch on your front bodice. The center back edges should be unfolded and match for the invisible zipper option. The center back edges should remain folded under for the back ties option. Sew along this pinned edge through all the layers using 1/2 inch or 13mm seam allowance. Sew with your bodice pieces facing up so you can use the previously sewn stitch line as your guide. Grade your seam allowances. Press your seam allowance up towards the front bodice and back bodice. With right sides facing, bring together the remaining front bodice and back bodice pieces to the remaining bottom bodice band pieces. Match the top notched edge of your bottom bodice band piece to the bottom edge of your front bodice and back bodice pieces. Pin together, matching notches along the way. Sew with 1/2 inch or 13mm seam allowance. Grade your seam allowances. Press your seam allowance down towards the bottom bodice band. This piece will now be referred to as your bodice lining. Your inner faced front bodice and back bodice will now be referred to as your outer bodice piece. Trim off 1/8 inch or 3mm from the top edge of your bodice lining. This will help keep the bodice lining layer hidden within the outer bodice layer. The following steps are just for an invisible zipper closure. Align the center back edges of your interfaced bottom bodice band with the center back edges of your bottom layer. Pin in place. If you chose to finish the bottom edge of your bottom bodice band by folding under 1/2 inch or 13mm, make sure to keep the edge folded under as you sew. Sew a straight stitch to secure the two layers together. Prepare your invisible zipper by pressing the teeth flat. Use a lower heat setting designated for synthetic materials. You do not want to melt your zipper teeth. Place your zipper face down and glide your iron over the teeth, gently pushing the teeth away from your zipper tape. With the zipper face down, pin the zipper tape to the right side of your garment along the center back edge, starting at the top edge of your back bodice down to the notch. Line up the top edge of your zipper in fabric. Align the zipper teeth to be 1/2 inch or 13mm away from the edge of your fabric. I'm aligning the very top of the zipper teeth 1/2 inch or 13mm away from the top edge as well. Pin your zipper teeth to be open. Make sure to keep your outer middle layer freely hanging and not pinned within the zipper. Use an invisible zipper foot if you have one. This is what it looks like. You could also use a regular zipper foot and move your needle position to line up with the groove of the zipper teeth. Sew your zipper in place from the top edge down to the notch. Close your zipper and mark the bodice seam placement on the opposite side of your zipper tape with chalk or your preferred marking tool. Unzip your zipper and then make sure to twist and flip your zipper to be face down. Pin your zipper teeth open on the second side, matching the mark you've made with the bodice seam along the way. It's easiest to start with that mark. Line up your zipper teeth 1/2 inch or 13 millimeters away from the center back edge. Pin from the top edge down to the notch. Sew using an invisible zipper foot if you have one, or use your regular zipper foot and move your needle position to line up with the groove of your zipper teeth. Sew from the top edge down to the notch. Push your zipper pull up through the opening and zip it closed. Your bodice seam should line up. Give your closed zipper a little press. It might be helpful to use a tailor's ham. With right sides facing, bring your bodice lining to your outer bodice piece along the top edge. Match the center back edges, side seams, and center front notches. The invisible zipper tape should be facing up and sandwiched in between the two layers. Pin along the top edge. Sew with 1/2 inch or 13 millimeter seam allowance. Grade your seam allowances. Press the seam allowance towards the bodice lining. I find it helpful to use a tailor's ham. Sew an understitch along the stitch line on the bodice lining side, making sure to catch the seam allowance underneath. Fold the bodice lining back towards the outer bodice with right sides facing. Pin along the center back edge. Make sure the center back edge of the outer bodice is unfolded with the zipper tape facing up and sandwiched in between the two layers. If you chose to fold the bottom edge of the bottom bodice band pieces, make sure to keep those edges folded. Pin together. Sew with 1/2 inch or 13 millimeter seam allowance just inside of the zipper teeth. Since I don't have a regular zipper foot for the sewing machine, I'm sewing as close as I can to the zipper teeth, which is closer to 1/4 inch or 6 millimeters, but that should be fine since it's just the lining piece. Fold your upper corner neatly and then turn your piece right side out. If you're using stiffer fabric, you may wish to trim the corner. Press your seams to be directly on the edge, slightly rolling inwards along the top edge due to the understitch. You may wish to add top stitching to the top edge of the bodice to help keep everything in place and to add extra strength to your straps. The following steps are just for the back ties option. With right sides facing, bring your bodice lining to your outer bodice piece along the top edge. Match the center back edges, side seams, and center front notches. Make sure the straps are sandwiched in between the layers and not twisted. The center back ties should be sandwiched in between the layers as well. Pin along the top edge, matching notches along the way. Sew with 1/2 inch or 13mm seam allowance. Grade your seam allowances. Press the seam allowance towards the bodice lining. I find it helpful to use a tailor's ham. Sew an understitch along the stitch line on the bodice lining side, making sure to catch the seam allowance underneath. Fold the bodice lining back towards the outer bodice with right sides facing. The bottom layer, for the dress, this is the bottom inner layer connected with the bottom middle layer. The bottom layer should not be caught in this center back seam, rather just outside of it so it can hang freely. Make sure the center back ties are sandwiched in between the layers. Pin the center back edges together, matching the bodice seam. Sew with 1/2 inch or 13mm seam allowance. Fold your upper corner neatly and then turn your piece right side out. You may wish to trim your corners if you are using a stiff fabric. Press your seams to be directly on the edges, slightly rolling inwards along the top edge due to the understitch. You may wish to add top stitching to the top edge of the bodice to help keep everything in place and to add extra strength to your straps. This is an optional step for adding foam bra cups. If you wish to add foam bra cups, try on your garment now and slip the bra cups in between the outer bodice and the bodice lining layers. Place the bra cups accordingly for your own personal preference. Pin them in place while fitting. Here I'm just loosely placing them and pinning them in place from the outside of the outer bodice, so that when I put it on for fitting, I have the pins and the bra cups already there. Okay, let's go fit this. After removing the garment, double check the placement feels relatively symmetrical to the center front, and then move the pins to the right side of the bodice lining layer only. I'm specifically pinning around the dart area and the bodice seam area. As well as one pin at the top underneath the strap. Stitch in the ditch, only sewing through the bodice lining and the foam bra cup. Sew along the dart seam to secure the foam bra cup in place. Sew along the bodice seam as well. You may wish to add a small stitch line at the top of the bra cup directly underneath the strap placement as well. The following step is just for the invisible zipper option. Pin the outer bodice and bodice lining layers together along the bottom edge, which is the bottom edge of your bottom bodice band pieces. Finish the bottom edge with option 1 or 2. Option 1 is to sew an edge stitch along the bottom edge. This is best used if you finished the bottom edge of your bottom bodice band pieces with an overlock or zigzag stitch. Option 2 is to hand sew a ladder stitch along the bottom edge. This is best used if you folded under your bottom bodice band pieces. I'm going to show you option 2. To sew a ladder stitch, you're going to sew by hand. I threaded a needle with a double thread and tied a knot. I'm hiding the knot in between the folded up seam allowance. To sew a ladder stitch, grab a tiny little bit of fabric from either edge of the seam you're trying to close. Here I'm grabbing a tiny bit of fabric for each stitch from either folded edge of the seam allowance. Then you pull tight to make the seam invisible. Sew around the entirety of the bottom bodice band pieces. The following steps are just for the back ties option. Bring the outer bodice and bodice lining layers together along the bottom edge, which is the bottom edge of your bottom bodice band pieces. Measure 15 inches or 38 centimeters along your bias tape, and then begin pinning your bias tape right sides facing to the bottom edges of your bottom bodice band pieces. When you make it around the entire bottom edge, measure 15 inches or 38 centimeters again from the center back edge along the bias tape, and then trim your bias tape. Sew using 1/2 inch or 13 millimeter seam allowance. Trim the bias tape that extends past the center back edge by 1/4 inch or 6 millimeters. Continue trimming 1/4 inch or 6 millimeters off the seam allowance. Press the bias tape away from the bottom bodice band pieces. Flip your piece to be right side down. Fold your bias tape in 1/4 inch or 6 millimeters along the raw edges and press. Fold the very ends of your extra bias tape that continues past the center back edges under 1/4 inch or 6 millimeters for an easy finished edge as you sew. Fold your bias tape over your raw seam allowance, completely enclosing it with the bias tape, and press in place. Make sure to keep the 1/4 inch or 6 millimeters folded under. You may wish to pin your bias tape in place from the right side. Alternatively, you can use a basting stitch or you can use basting glue to secure your bias tape before sewing an edge stitch from the right side of the bodice lining. Sew an edge stitch along the bias tape, catching the folded bias tape on the underside of your piece. Continue stitching the additional length of bias tape past the center back edges by sewing an edge stitch to keep the bias tape neatly folded into a 1/4 inch or 6mm strings. Sew together one short edge of your side bottom ruffle and one short edge of your front and back bottom ruffle with option 1 or 2. Option 1 is a French seam. You can watch my more detailed stitch instruction video for how to sew a French seam. Option 2 is to use an overlock or zigzag stitch to finish the edges. Bring the pieces right sides together. Pin your side bottom ruffle and front and back bottom ruffle pieces together along one of the short edges. Sew with 1/2 inch or a 13mm seam allowance. Finish the seam allowance with an overlock or zigzag stitch. Press the seam allowance in one direction. Repeat your chosen seam method for the second side edge of your front and back bottom ruffle, attaching your second side bottom ruffle piece. Repeat your chosen seam method again for attaching the second front and back bottom ruffle piece to your side bottom ruffle pieces along the remaining short edges to create a complete circle. Sewing with a basting stitch length of approximately 4 to 5, stitch along the top edge of your side bottom ruffle and front and back bottom ruffle pieces with 3/8 of an inch or 1 centimeter seam allowance. I'm going to sew with a trick of tightening your tension pretty much as it can go, which will act as a gathering foot for my sewing machine. The tight tension makes it pull the fabric into a ruffle. For this extra long ruffle for the bottom tier of your dress, it's really helpful to do a little gathering trick like this to eliminate some of the time it takes to gather by hand. Sew the side bottom ruffle pieces and each of the front and back bottom ruffle pieces top edges separately to make the gathering easier. Leave your beginning and ending threads extra long. Sew with a 5/8 inch or 16mm seam allowance as well. Gather your piece until the top edge measures equal length to the bottom edge of your outer middle layer. Make sure the side seams line up as well as the center back notch to the center back seam and the center front notches. If you need more detailed instructions, you can watch my video specifically for how to gather. From this point on, the side bottom ruffle and the front and back bottom ruffle will be referred to as the bottom tier ruffle. Bring your outer middle layer right sides together with the gathered bottom tier ruffle. Match the bottom edge of your outer middle layer to the top gathered edge of your bottom tier ruffle. Pin in place, matching side seams and center front notches along the way, as well as center back notch to center back seam. Set your stitch length back to a regular amount of 2.5 or 3mm and sew along your pinned edge with 1/2 inch or 13mm seam allowance. You should be sewing in between your 2 basting stitch lines. Keep your basting stitches intact for now. Choose how you would like to finish your seam allowance with option 1 or 2. Option 1 is to use an overlock or zigzag stitch, which I'm doing here. Option 2 is to use a bias binding. You can see my more detailed stitch instruction video for how to sew a bias binding. Press the seam away from the bottom tier ruffle. Remove the basting stitches with a seam ripper and thread scissors. Now is a good moment to try on your garment one last time before the final sewing step, which is hemming. Along the bottom hem of your garment, fold under 1/4 inch or 6 millimeters towards the wrong side of your fabric and press in place. Fold under 1/4 inch or 6 millimeters a second time around the same bottom edge to enclose the raw edge completely. Press in place again. Sew an edge stitch around the entirety of the hem of your garment. Repeat these steps for your bottom inner layer. Fold 1/4 inch or 6 millimeters towards the wrong side of your fabric and press in place. Then repeat and fold a second time around to completely enclose the raw edge. Sew an edge stitch. For the back ties option, finish the raw ends of your center back ties by pushing in 1/2 inch or 13 millimeters of fabric within the tubular end. I like to use the tip of my thread scissors to push in the raw edges of my fabric. You can either sew using an edge stitch or hand sew a ladder stitch to secure the ends in place. Here I'm hand sewing a ladder stitch. Or you can sew an edge stitch. For the invisible zipper option, you can add a hook and eye to the center back top edge to make zipping up easier. Hand sew the hook and eye at the top corner edge on either side of your center back zipper. You may wish to secure your pocket bag in place so that it doesn't flip outside of the outer metal layer while dancing around. We all know what this dress is made for. Spinning! Stitch in the ditch along the seam just at the bottom corner of your pocket bag. Pin your pocket bag in place just at the bottom corner, pinning from the right side of your garment. I'm pinning at the side seam so that I can stitch in the ditch along the side seam. Stitch in the ditch from the right side of your garment along the seam just at the bottom corner of your pocket bag.